I have collected more than 100 disturbing historical photos. Write in the comments, which photo did you like the most? In July 1925, the Scopes monkey trial ended in Dayton, Tennessee, where teacher John Scopes was found guilty and fined $100 for teaching evolution. Intense courtroom heat forced the judge to move the proceedings outdoors, creating one of America's most famous trials. During World War II, the B-17 Flying Fortress Eradicator of the 452nd Bomb Group became the only original aircraft in its unit to survive its entire combat tour over Europe. It completed 120 bombing missions and 138 takeoffs, an exceptional achievement for a heavy bomber of its era. A tenant farmer eats lunch in Muskogee, Oklahoma in 1939 during the final years of the Great Depression. Drinking coffee from a saucer was a common custom because the larger surface cooled it faster, helping workers return to the fields without waiting. In 1915, Indian soldiers serving in the British Army defended the Suez Canal in Egypt by helping repel an Ottoman attack during the First World War. Their victory protected one of Britain's most important supply routes, linking Europe with India and the wider British Empire. On July 21, 1972, comedian George Carlin was arrested in Milwaukee after performing his famous 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television routine at the Summerfest Festival. The routine later became central to a landmark 1978 Supreme Court case that reshaped broadcast censorship in the United States. A United States Army CH-47 Chinook lowers supplies into Firebase Ripcord in South Vietnam on July 21, 1970, as North Vietnamese forces tightened their siege. The isolated mountaintop base was evacuated the following day after weeks of intense fighting. This aerial image shows Turkish landing ships approaching Pentimili, or 5 Mile Beach, near Kyrenia, on July 20, 1974, during the opening hours of the invasion of Cyprus. The assault followed a Greek-backed coup on the island and began a conflict that left Cyprus divided to this day. In 1958, photographer Bruce Davidson documented Jimmy Armstrong, a circus performer with dwarfism, during quiet moments backstage in New Jersey. The portrait became part of Davidson's circus series, which focused less on spectacle than on the private lives of performers. Born in Hartwell, Georgia, in 1906, John Clayton Snow began performing with his sister Elvira at Coney Island's World Circus Sideshow around 1928. Known for his thoughtful nature, he followed World War II closely and remained part of the act until his death in 1957. In July 1944, soldiers of the United States 79th Infantry Division searched German prisoners beside the Church of Saint-Jean in La Haye-du-Puy, Normandy. The town had just fallen after fierce fighting during the Allied advance inland from the D-Day beaches. Manufactured in Perm in 1989, the TA-68CB-2 was a Soviet central battery telephone with no rotary dial, connecting users through a manual switchboard. Built for government offices, military sites, and secure factories, it relied on wired exchanges rather than direct dialing. This 1970s family photograph shows Argentine dentist Ricardo Barreda with his daughters Cecilia and Adriana, years before the case that shocked the country. On November 15, 1992, he killed both daughters, his wife, and his mother-in-law inside their home in La Plata. Edith Filatovich, better known as Stella, was one of the tattooed women who appeared in American sideshows during the early 20th century. This publicity portrait credits the artist Deffy, whose full-body work turned her skin into a carefully staged attraction. In September 1965, 4 United States Air Force C-123 aircraft flew over South Vietnam, spraying Agent Orange during Operation Ranch Hand. Each pass covered a strip about 1,000 feet wide, removing dense vegetation around suspected Viet Cong positions and supply routes below. In 1989, demonstrators held candles outside the KGB headquarters on Moscow's Lubyanka Square to honor victims of Stalinist repression on the Day of Political Prisoners. The vigil broke decades of public silence surrounding arrests, labor camps, executions, and political persecution. Martha, photographed at Cincinnati Zoo in 1912, was the last known passenger pigeon, a species that once crossed North America in flocks of billions. Her death on September 1, 1914, marked its extinction after mass hunting, and forest loss erased a population once believed limitless. In 1926, a member of the Achilles Serre Ladies Fire Brigade smashes a window during a training drill in London, wearing the unit's full uniform. The company formed its own women's brigade to protect its large dry cleaning works, where fire posed a constant industrial danger. Polish prisoners celebrate inside Dachau near Munich after United States troops liberated the camp on April 29, 1945. Many had survived forced labor, starvation, disease, and years of confinement in one of Nazi Germany's first permanent concentration camps, opened in 1933. Ludmila Pavlichenko joined the Red Army after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and became one of history's most successful snipers. During the sieges of Odessa and Sevastopol, she recorded 309 confirmed kills before a wound ended her frontline service in 1942. On July 21, 1970, a United States Army CH-47 Chinook lowered supplies into Firebase Ripcord, an isolated mountaintop base under siege in South Vietnam. After weeks of fighting against North Vietnamese forces, American troops evacuated the exposed position the following day. Invented in 1931 by Indiana University biochemist Rolla Harger, the drunkometer became the first practical roadside breath test. Drivers blew into a balloon, and their breath passed through chemicals that changed color, allowing police to estimate blood alcohol levels. Polish teacher Władysław Bielinski stands under German guard in 1939, only minutes before his execution during the occupation of Poland. His final photograph became a stark record of the campaign of terror directed against Polish civilians, teachers, and community leaders. In 1907, a streetcar collided with a train in Lexington, Kentucky, crushing the passenger car and scattering wreckage across the tracks. Crowds gathered while rescuers searched through the splintered debris, revealing the severe dangers of early urban rail travel. 15-year-old Leon Mergian, the youngest known member of the French Volunteer Legion against Bolshevism, stands in Golovkovo near Moscow in 1941. The unit served as the Wehrmacht's 638th Infantry Regiment and fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. In 1944, Muslim women marched through a Yugoslav city with placards praising Josip Broz Tito and Joseph Stalin during the final phase of the war. The demonstration reflected support for the Yugoslav partisans and their Soviet ally in the fight against Axis occupation. 5 liberated mothers hold infants born during their imprisonment at Dachau in 1945, shortly after United States troops reached the camp in southern Germany. Despite starvation, disease, and brutal conditions, the women and their babies survived until liberation on April 29th. On June 27, 1944, American troops reached the entrance to a German underground fortress at Cherbourg, France, after the port city fell during the Normandy campaign. The fortified tunnels had sheltered troops, vehicles, and equipment during the final defense of the vital harbor. On August 21, 1975, police in Salt Lake City stopped Ted Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle after he drove without headlights and tried to flee. Inside, officers found masks, rope, handcuffs, gloves, and other items, later linked to the kidnapping of survivor Carol Duranch. Captured near Puerto Vallarta, Mexico in 2018, this snaggle-toothed snake eel displays the long body and needle-like teeth that give the species its name. It can grow to about 3 feet and inhabits tropical coastal waters, sometimes only 16 feet below the surface. On September 1, 1939, German Luftwaffe aircraft bombed the Polish town of Wielun in one of the opening attacks of World War II. The raid struck a hospital and residential districts, killing civilians and destroying much of the town before Poland had formally declared war. On September 8, 1900, a powerful hurricane struck Galveston, Texas, destroying thousands of buildings and killing an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 people. The disaster remains the deadliest natural disaster in United States history and led to major changes in coastal protection. Set into the churchyard wall at Great Wishford, England, these breadstones record local bread prices from 1800 onward. The 1971 stone showed that a loaf cost nearly 50% more than in 1965, turning inflation into a public chronicle of everyday life. During the Hamburg flood of February 1962, rescuers crossed submerged streets by boat after storm tides overwhelmed the city's defenses. A German soldier carried a child to safety in a bathtub, while families across the Elbe region lost homes, fields, and nearly all they owned. In 1975, former First Lady Betty Ford met Vietnamese refugee children at Camp Pendleton, California, after they were evacuated during the fall of Saigon. The base became one of 4 major United States reception centers, temporarily housing tens of thousands of refugees. Around 1978, soldiers tested some of the earliest portable GPS receivers, carrying bulky backpack units and long antennas to track their position in the field. The equipment was heavy and experimental, but it marked the beginning of satellite navigation for military operations. In May 1918, Private Henry Johnson of the 369th Infantry fought off a German raiding party in France, using his rifle, knife, and bare hands to protect a wounded comrade. Though badly injured, he forced the attackers to retreat and later received France's Croix de Guerre. On August 16, 1960, United States Air Force Captain Joseph Kittinger leapt from the Excelsior 3 balloon at 102,800 feet above New Mexico. During the 13-minute descent, he reached about 614 miles per hour, setting records for altitude, freefall distance, and speed. During World War I, Bulgarian soldiers on the southern front aimed their rifles at an approaching enemy aircraft. With anti-aircraft weapons still scarce, infantry units sometimes relied on coordinated volleys to defend their positions from aerial attack. In 1918, surrendered German submarine U-155 was displayed beside Tower Bridge in London after Britain received it at the end of World War I. Originally built to carry cargo through the British blockade as Deutschland, it was later converted into a long-range naval raider. In 1941, Jewish women and children were marched through Lithuania under guard by members of a local self-defense unit assisting the German occupation. Such auxiliaries helped round up, confine, and deport Jewish civilians during the opening phase of the Holocaust in Lithuania. American bombers strike Japanese transport ships in Simpson Harbor at Rabaul, New Britain, during the Allied air offensive of 1943. The harbor was Japan's main base in the South Pacific, making its crowded shipping a constant target for repeated air raids. In 1960, a United States Air Force C-119 flying boxcar caught a descending capsule carrying exposed film from a Corona spy satellite. The mid-air recovery kept the classified photographs out of the ocean and returned them rapidly for intelligence analysis. In 1960, a United States Air Force C-119 flying boxcar caught a descending capsule carrying exposed film from a Corona spy satellite. The mid-air recovery kept the classified photographs out of the ocean and returned them rapidly for intelligence analysis. In 1941, a Soviet Tupolev SB bomber falls in flames near a crossing over the Berezina River during Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. The aircraft had been hit while operating above a vital route crowded with retreating troops, vehicles, and military supplies. On May 14, 1988, Iraqi aircraft attacked the Sea-Wise Giant while it carried Iranian crude near Larak Island during the Iran-Iraq War. The world's largest supertanker burned and sank in shallow water, but it was later salvaged, rebuilt, and returned to service. In 1864, Union troops under General William T. Sherman tore up railroad tracks in Atlanta, Georgia, before continuing their campaign through the South. They heated and twisted the rails around trees, creating Sherman's neckties that were difficult for Confederate forces to repair. On October 9, 1942, Sergeant Fyodor Konoplyov's crew fired a heavy machine gun at German aircraft over besieged Leningrad. Its tracer rounds formed a bright arc above the Neva as ground units defended the city during relentless air raids. In August 1975, a Japanese Red Army gunman escorts 2 hostages during the AIA building siege in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The militants seized more than 50 people, including foreign diplomats, and secured the release of 5 imprisoned comrades before flying to Libya. In 1919, Russian bag traders crowded freight cars with sacks of goods, traveling between cities and villages to barter for food during the Civil War. With official supplies collapsing and rationing failing, these journeys became a vital means of survival for millions. In March 1960, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara marched through Havana during a public parade celebrating Cuba's new revolutionary government. Surrounded by armed rebels and civilian supporters, they embodied the leadership that had overthrown Fulgencio Batista the previous year. During the winter of 1940, a Dutch woman dries tightly packed paper briquettes on a balcony as coal and firewood became scarce under German occupation. Made from soaked waste paper, these homemade fuel balls were burned in household stoves for heating and cooking. During filming of The Fifth Element in 1996, Mila Jovovich stands on set in Lilu's famous white thermal bandage costume before its 1997 release. Designed by Jean-Paul Gaultier, the minimalist outfit became one of the most recognizable science fiction costumes of the 1990s. In 1928, zoo attendants in St. Louis restrained a giant python that had refused food for 7 weeks and force-fed it 3 rabbits. The bizarre procedure drew a crowd and reflected the crude animal care practices common in early 20th century zoos. During the Russian Civil War, the crew of a Red Army armored train posed beside its damaged gun turret after a direct hit. A coffin placed on the roof holds the gunner killed in the strike, turning the photograph into both a battle record and a field memorial before repairs began. A United States Navy salvage crew hoists a damaged F-14A Tomcat from the sea after the fighter sank during an accident. Cranes and support ships carefully raise the waterlogged aircraft, allowing investigators to examine the wreckage and recover sensitive equipment. This was Hermann Göring's cell at Nuremberg prison, where he was held after being sentenced to death by the International Military Tribunal. On October 15, 1946, only hours before his scheduled hanging, he died by suicide using a cyanide capsule hidden from his guards. Around 1905, an 80-year-old Fijian man, known as Cannibal Tom, was photographed holding a spear and marketed as the island's last surviving cannibal. The stereograph reflected a colonial trade in sensational images long after cannibalism had largely disappeared. An interracial couple poses together in the early 20th century, when such relationships faced intense hostility and legal restrictions across much of the United States. Interracial marriage remained illegal in many states until the Supreme Court ended those laws in 1967. North Korean refugees move in long columns across open farmland during the Korean War, carrying what they could as fighting swept through the peninsula. Millions of civilians were displaced between 1950 and 1953, often walking for days toward uncertain safety in the south. Japanese Yakuza members display elaborate full-body Irizumi tattoos, traditionally linked to loyalty, endurance, and underworld identity. Created through long, painful sessions, the designs were usually hidden beneath clothing and shown only in private gatherings. In 1901, French police found Blanche Monnier locked in a dark room in Poitiers, where her aristocratic mother had kept her isolated for about 25 years. Once a young socialite, she was discovered severely malnourished after an anonymous letter exposed the family's secret. In 1951, an Indian Army ambulance driver lies severely wounded during the Korean War, clasping his hands as medics prepared to evacuate him. Despite a devastating leg injury and intense pain, he remained conscious, creating one of the conflict's most striking images of endurance. During the final months of World War II, Japanese schoolgirls trained with bamboo spears as the government prepared civilians for a possible Allied invasion. With rifles scarce, schools and neighborhood groups practiced close combat against armed troops. In 1968, a Soviet soldier photographed graffiti in Czechoslovakia, declaring, "USSR, go home, enemies," during the Warsaw Pact invasion. The slogan captured public anger as Soviet-led forces crushed the Prague Spring and ended Alexander Dubček's political reform movement. In 1941, workers at a Moscow factory filled and sealed bottles of flammable liquid for use against German tanks advancing toward the Soviet capital. These improvised incendiary weapons were rushed to Red Army units and civilian defenders during the desperate Battle of Moscow. These paired views show Nagasaki before and after the United States dropped the plutonium bomb Fat Man on August 9, 1945. The explosion devastated the Urakami district, destroyed factories and homes, and killed tens of thousands of people within months. In 1940, representatives of the Navajo, Apache, Hopi, and Papago peoples signed a declaration in Arizona renouncing the swastika in their art and clothing. The ancient symbol had long carried positive meanings in native cultures, but Nazi Germany had made it politically toxic. On August 27, 1955, an explosion at Standard Oil's Whiting refinery in Indiana sent a towering fireball above nearby homes and ignited an 8-day blaze. The disaster killed 2 people, injured dozens, and forced about 1,500 residents to evacuate. In August 1952, Marilyn Monroe visited a children's hospital in Atlantic City, New Jersey, signing photographs and speaking with young patients. The appearance came as her career was accelerating, months before Niagara and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes made her an international star. In 1919, a German street performer in Berlin balanced a seated soldier high above his face using only the strength of his jaw and neck. The feat drew a dense crowd, offering rare public entertainment amid the hardship and unrest following Germany's defeat in World War I. In 1943, Danish resistance member Johannes Rasmussen secretly became a Gestapo informant, exposing underground contacts during Germany's occupation of Denmark. After the war, he was arrested, convicted of treason for collaborating with the occupiers, and executed in 1948. Built around 820, the Oseberg ship was buried near Tønsberg, Norway, with 2 women and lavish grave goods before its excavation in 1904. Preserved by dense clay, the richly carved oak vessel remains one of the finest surviving ships from the Viking Age. Around 1890, Tsarevich Nicholas and Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna posed as Eugene Onegin and Tatiana Larina in a private theatrical performance. 4 years later, Nicholas married Elizabeth's younger sister Alex, who became Alexandra, Russia's last empress. On July 20, 1945, President Harry Truman joined Dwight Eisenhower, George Patton, Omar Bradley, and Henry Stimson as the United States flag was raised over Berlin. The ceremony marked the formal arrival of American authority in the defeated German capital. During World War II, WASP pilot Betty Tack Tackaberry mastered heavy bombers, including the B-17, B-24, and B-26, along with major American fighters. She ferried aircraft, tested military machines, and helped free male pilots for combat assignments overseas. In 1945, Albert Stevens was secretly injected with plutonium during a United States government radiation experiment after doctors wrongly suspected terminal cancer. He survived another 20 years, absorbing the highest known lifetime internal radiation dose ever recorded in a human. On July 20, 1974, Turkish Cypriot children greeted Turkish soldiers arriving near Kyrenia during the opening day of the Cyprus conflict. The landing followed a Greek-backed coup in Nicosia, and began the campaign that ultimately left the island divided. In February 1945, United States Marines paused for a meal beside the wreckage of a Japanese aircraft during the battle for Iwo Jima. The brief rest came amid weeks of brutal fighting for the Japanese-held volcanic island, where fortified defenses made every advance costly. Around 1970, several generations of a Soviet family gathered for a group portrait beside their car, with grandparents, parents, and children filling the frame. The photograph preserves an ordinary family moment from late Soviet life, far removed from official ceremonies. In 1897, a newlywed Victorian couple posed with relatives and guests in a conservatory, surrounded by palms, formal dress, and elaborate bridal fashion. The scene reflects the strict etiquette and public display that shaped upper-class weddings in the late 19th century. In March 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. was convicted by an all-white jury after a trial lasting only hours in South Carolina. Executed 3 months later, he became the youngest person put to death in 20th century America. His conviction was overturned in 2014. On August 21, 1968, Prague residents tried to stop Soviet tanks with a Czechoslovak flag and Molotov cocktails. The invasion crushed the Prague Spring, ending Czechoslovakia's brief hope for freedom. At 15, Ted Kaczynski was already a math prodigy, pictured here in 1958 with other national merit scholars. That same year, Harvard accepted him, long before he became the Unabomber. On July 15, 1966, a Marine CH-46 Sea Knight was hit by North Vietnamese 12.7mm fire over Vietnam's Nguyen Valley. Smoke blinded the cockpit. The helicopter crashed and exploded, killing 13 Marines and giving the place its brutal name, Helicopter Valley. At the 1936 Berlin Olympics, marathon legend Spiridon Louis handed Adolf Hitler an olive branch from Olympia. Louis had won Greece's first modern Olympic marathon 40 years earlier, turning this brief ceremony into a chilling meeting of sport, politics, and propaganda. In 2003, U.S. soldiers played Xbox inside one of Saddam Hussein's former palaces in Baghdad. The strange scene showed war pushed into luxury, with a game console sitting where a dictator once ruled. Rare private Polaroids show Saddam Hussein with Sajida, Uday, and his grandchildren in the 1990s. The photos were reportedly found inside Uday Hussein's residence during the invasion of Iraq. In 1943, B-17 crews over Merseburg flew straight through heavy German flak because breaking formation could leave them defenseless. This training film showed pilots how to dodge bursts, but in real combat, one wrong turn could expose the whole bomber box. At Loos in 1915, British soldiers walked straight into poison gas after the wind pushed it back toward their own lines. Many men could barely see or breathe, but the attack still continued through the choking cloud. In 1957, Dorothy Counts walked into Harding High School while a crowd spat, shouted, and threw trash at her. She lasted only 4 days, but her calm face became one of the strongest images of school desegregation in America. On July 23, 1967, a police raid on an illegal Detroit bar sparked 5 days of riots. Tanks rolled through the city, federal troops arrived, and 43 people were killed. In 1907, the Hudson River was packed with Adirondack logs, floated downstream to feed New York's booming lumber mills. Men stood on the moving timber with poles, risking death in seconds if one log rolled wrong. Biddy Mason was forced to walk 1,700 miles while enslaved, then fought back in a California court. She won her freedom in 1856 and became one of the richest women in Los Angeles. Franz Reichelt tested his parachute suit from the Eiffel Tower in 1912 after police thought he would use a dummy. He jumped himself, the suit failed, and his death became one of the first fatal accidents ever filmed. In the 1950s, Robert Earl Hughes was billed in sideshows as the heaviest man in the world. Away from crowds, he was a quiet reader and photographer, remembered by neighbors for his gentle mind. In 1935, divers searched for RMS Lusitania, sunk by a German submarine in 1915 with nearly 1,200 people lost. They went down in heavy suits, chasing answers inside one of World War I's most infamous wrecks. In London, 1952, the smog was so thick that police directed traffic with burning flares in daylight. The air killed thousands, and this disaster pushed Britain to create new, clean air laws. In 1986 at Dulles, NASA's shuttle Enterprise sat on its Boeing 747 carrier while a British Airways Concorde lifted off behind it. One photo caught two machines that looked impossible: a reusable spacecraft and a supersonic airliner, both now retired forever. During the Blitz in 1940, a London milkman walked through bomb rubble to keep deliveries going. The photo became a symbol of British defiance, but it was partly staged to pass wartime censorship. Paula Maxa became famous at Paris Grand Guignol as the most murdered woman on stage. She was killed over 10,000 times in more than 60 different ways, while crowds paid to watch her die. An Austro-Hungarian soldier demonstrates throwing a Rohr hand grenade from standing and kneeling positions. In the right photo, the grenade's round shape is visible inside the ammunition bag hanging from his neck. In 1974, government soldiers led away a survivor after a Khmer Rouge massacre in Cambodia. She had just escaped a killing zone where whole villages were being erased before the world fully understood it. In 1951, doctors took Henrietta Lacks's cancer cells without asking her, and those cells became the first human cells to live endlessly in labs. Her HeLa cells helped create the polio vaccine, advanced cancer research, gene mapping, and IVF, while her family knew almost nothing for decades. The morning after Chernobyl exploded, helicopters flew over the shattered reactor, dropping sand, lead, and boron into the radioactive fire. Many pilots were sent straight into deadly radiation, and some later died from the exposure. In April 1975, ARVN helicopters evacuated troops and supplies from Juan Loc, the last major battle before Saigon fell. Within weeks, South Vietnam collapsed. In 1917, police photographed Alessandro Valero, a 28-year-old boss of the Brooklyn Camorra. His gang fought a bloody New York underworld war before witnesses finally helped break its power. In 1945, Albert Stevens was secretly injected with plutonium by doctors who told him it was treatment. He survived 20 years, carrying the highest known internal radiation dose ever recorded. In 1955, Mamie Till Mobley chose an open casket so America could see what had been done to her 14-year-old son, Emmett Till. Those photos shocked the nation and helped ignite the civil rights movement. In January 1953, this was Dwight Eisenhower's inauguration, seen from high above the United States Capitol. More than 100,000 people packed the grounds to watch a World War II commander become president. On July 21, 1944, United States Marines hit Agate Beach on Guam, under fire from Japanese positions. This landing helped retake Guam after more than 2 years of occupation. On February 19, 1945, hundreds of U.S. ships closed in on Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island Japan had turned into a fortress. The battle lasted 36 days and became one of the bloodiest marine fights of the Second World War. 8 minutes after the landing on Guam in 1944, 2 American officers raised this flag on a boat hook. The island had been under Japanese control for over 2.5 years, and this moment marked the first sign it was being taken back. In 1884, Newspaper Row was where New York's biggest papers fought to break news first. Outside the Tribune building, crowds waited for headlines that could move markets, ruin reputations, or start panic. These women were the human computers of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, doing rocket math by hand before modern computers existed. In the 1950s, their calculations helped guide America's first satellites into space. In May 1945, French paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Chasseurs Regiment trained by jumping from American Douglas C-47 Skytrains. Just days after the war in Europe ended, these men were already preparing for the next airborne missions. In England in 1935, engineers tested a tracked ferry that could crawl from the beach straight into the sea. It was built for places where tides destroyed normal docks, letting people board without a pier. Hamoir, Belgium, May 11th to 12th, 1940. German soldiers stripped below the waist to rush a river crossing with rifles and gear held above the water. In the first days of the invasion, speed mattered so much that some crossings happened with almost no engineering support. In 1950, Thailand crowned Bhumibol Adulyadej as Rama IX, 4 years after he became king at age 18. He ruled for 70 years and later controlled one of the largest royal fortunes on earth. In 1950, 2 women posed on the carousel at Rockaway Playland, a famous seaside amusement park in Queens, New York. The park later vanished forever, but photos like this kept its wild summer energy alive. Pretty Nose was an Arapaho war chief said to have fought at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. She later lived to see her Marine grandson return from Korea in 1952, when she was about 101. Vietnamese refugees visited the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia in the 1970s after fleeing a war that had torn their country apart. For many of them, this was one of their first close looks at America's most famous symbol of freedom. This Apollo 11 photo, signed by Buzz Aldrin, sold for $64,000, more than 10 times its high estimate. In silver ink, Aldrin wrote what he noticed on the moon: an extra reflection on the lunar module when stepping from sunlight into shadow. In December 1969, South Korean soldiers guarded the Central Korean Demilitarized Zone, one of the most tense borders on Earth. The rifle, winter gear, and hidden position show how close a quiet patrol could be to sudden combat. These German soldiers were captured at Malteau, near Caen, in 1944 after brutal fighting in Normandy. Their medals and worn uniforms show they were not fresh recruits, but experienced men caught as Germany began losing the West. In 1864, a Union Army brass band played on top of Lookout Mountain after one of the Civil War's most dramatic victories. The cliff was so high that soldiers joked the music was being played above the clouds. Apollo 13 was crippled by an oxygen tank explosion, yet its crew survived by turning the lunar module into a lifeboat. On April 17, 1970, they fell back to Earth and splashed down alive in the South Pacific. At Posieres on July 23, 1916, an Anzac soldier shaved while wearing a captured German Pickelhaube. Around him, exhausted men rested after one of the bloodiest Australian fights of World War I. In Rome in 1970, Ingrid Bergman walked beside her daughter, Isabella Rossellini, who was not yet a film star. Years later, Isabella became the face of Lancôme and built her own cinema legend. In July 1983, Lake Mead rose so high that water poured over Hoover Dam spillway gates for the first time in history. The roar was so violent it damaged the concrete tunnels built to control it. Steve Ballmer took the stage at Microsoft's 25th anniversary in 2000, when the company was already under massive antitrust pressure. Just months later, he became chief executive and had to lead Microsoft through one of its most dangerous eras. Italian soldiers of the Tridentina Division moved through Scelgiacchino on January 25, 1943, during the brutal retreat from the Soviet front. Many Alpini escaped encirclement, but thousands froze, vanished, or were taken prisoner in the snow. A century ago, women in New York marched with signs because they still had no vote in city elections. In 1917, New York women finally won full voting rights, 3 years before the United States changed forever. In 1897, Buffalo soldiers called the Iron Riders biked 1,900 miles from Montana to St. Louis on heavy Army bicycles. Each man carried a 60-pound pack, and they finished the brutal trip in just 41 days. In 1935, Soho, this woman sold hot chestnuts from a coal-fired street cart, a cheap winter snack for workers and theater crowds. Her job looked simple, but it meant standing for hours in smoke, cold, and London fog just to earn coins. In early 1942, British prisoners captured near Benghazi were searched by an Italian soldier after Axis forces retook the city. Libya changed hands again and again, turning thousands of exhausted soldiers into prisoners within days. Argentine diplomat Roberto Kozak helped hundreds of Chileans escape Pinochet's dictatorship after the 1973 coup. He used his post in Santiago to move political prisoners and hunted dissidents out before they vanished. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas II brought his family to Soldatnikov Hospital to meet wounded Russian soldiers. Within 3 years, the empire collapsed, and everyone in this front row was living under a death sentence. In 1940, German engineers tested a Messerschmitt Bf-109 inside a giant wind tunnel to study every weakness in its shape. These tests helped tune one of the most feared fighter planes of the Second World War. Mykola Bokin photographed his family in Ukraine in 1933, marking 300 days without bread. On the wall, he wrote the date himself, turning one watery meal into evidence of the Holodomor. Alexander Bogdanov believed young blood could slow aging, so he tested transfusions on himself 11 times. In 1928, his 12th transfusion came from a sick student, and the experiment killed him. In 1940, a young Fidel Castro wrote to Franklin Roosevelt from Colegio Dolores, asking for a green $10 bill because he had never seen one. The money never came, and 19 years later, that boy led the Cuban Revolution. In 1944, General George Patton pinned the Silver Star on Private Ernest Jenkins of the all-black 761st Tank Battalion. His unit fought through Europe for 183 days straight, proving its courage while still facing segregation at home. Frans Tijbosch, known as Kliko, was a Koranen dancer from South Africa who became a sideshow star in 1913. His act became so famous that he was pulled into a bitter rivalry with another performer, William Henry Johnson. On August 25, 1944, a wounded crewman is carried from a B-24 Liberator at RAF Horsham St. Faith. The crowd is silent because this bomber made it home, but not everyone inside escaped unharmed. On August 6, 1944, armed soldiers guarded Philadelphia streetcars after white transit workers walked out to stop black employees from being promoted. The strike froze a major war production city, so the United States Army took over the transit system and forced it back open. Around 1900, the Brooklyn Bridge carried trains, streetcars, carriages, and walkers all at once. Below it, Manhattan was still packed with low rooftops, smoking factories, and river piers before the skyscraper age took over. Sophia Loren laughs outside Cinecittà Studios in Rome in 1957 during a break from filming Legend of the Lost. The movie paired her with John Wayne, but this candid moment feels more powerful than any staged scene. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Birmingham in 1963 after protesting segregation without a permit. From his jail cell, he wrote one of the most famous defenses of civil rights in American history. In April 1942, Japanese-American families waited at Santa Anita, a former horse racetrack turned detention center. Many were forced to live in converted horse stalls before being sent to remote camps. In 1973, New York's West Side Highway was so rotten that drivers were crossing a road already breaking apart beneath them. That December, a dump truck punched through the elevated deck, and the highway was closed forever. In 1956, drunk pilot Thomas Fitzpatrick stole a plane and landed it on a narrow Manhattan street outside the bar he had just left. 2 years later, someone called the story fake, so he stole another plane and did it again. In 1942, U.S. military jeeps were shipped in wooden crates with wheels, tools, and parts packed tightly around them. This let factories send thousands overseas fast, where crews could unpack and assemble a battlefield vehicle in hours. In 1908, German apothecary Julius Neubronner patented tiny chest cameras for pigeons, turning them into living aerial photographers. During World War I, armies tested the idea for spying, but the birds were too unpredictable to trust. In Alabama, 1936, these griffin children were rejected by white families and also kept apart from black families. Under the one-drop rule, one rumored black ancestor could decide their entire lives. Walter H. Stewart, born in Maine without hands or feet, became a famous sideshow performer known for carving wood, sewing, dressing himself, and sharp conversation. In 1879, he narrowly escaped a fire, adding another strange chapter to his already extraordinary life. Italian troops in North Africa, 1942, lie behind a Breda Model 30, a weapon notorious for jamming in sand. Their Carcano rifles were reliable, but desert dust often decided the fight before the enemy did. Russian soldiers pose in early gas masks during the First World War, when poison gas turned trenches into death traps. Some masks were so primitive that one bad fit could mean blindness, choking, or death. In 1937, Edward VIII visited Nazi Germany with Wallace Simpson and shook hands with Adolf Hitler. British intelligence later feared Hitler wanted to restore Edward as king and use him as a puppet. Write in the comments which photo you like the most and why.